Long Island's Oyster Festival returned this weekend, and it's the first time in 3 years. It drew hundreds of thousands of people.
And now those buckets of discarded shells are being repurposed, shall we say.
500,000 tons of oyster shells and stone were dumped into the waters off Florida's Gulf Coast, and most people expected very little to happen. The area had already lost much of its historic oyster reef system, and previous restoration efforts had struggled to make a lasting difference. But what unfolded beneath the surface surprised even the scientists involved. Life returned at an astonishing pace, and when powerful hurricanes later struck the region, the project faced a test nobody could have predicted: the coastline that was quietly dying. The success of Florida's reef restoration project becomes even more remarkable when you realize how close this ecosystem came to disappearing altogether. In September 2024, Hurricane Helene slammed into Florida's Big Bend region with devastating force. Powerful winds and a storm surge reaching nearly 12 feet left destruction across Cedar Key. Homes were damaged, boats were tossed far from shore, and many local fishermen and shellfish farmers faced enormous losses. For people whose livelihoods depended on the water, it was one of the most difficult moments they had ever experienced. Yet while communities struggled to recover, something unusual was happening offshore. Near the mouth of the Suwannee River sat a constructed oyster reef that researchers had spent years developing. After the hurricane passed, scientists returned to inspect the site. Considering the strength of the storm, many would have expected major damage. Instead, the reef was still standing. Even more surprising, living oysters remained attached to the structure. That discovery raised an important question: how could a restored reef survive conditions that had devastated so much of the surrounding coastline? The answer begins years earlier, when Florida's oyster reefs were facing a crisis that few people outside the region fully understood. By the early 2000s, vast stretches of oyster habitat in Suwannee Sound were disappearing. Reefs that had existed for thousands of years were slowly losing elevation and breaking apart. Areas that once supported thriving oyster populations were transforming into exposed sandbars. What had taken centuries to build was vanishing within a single generation. Researchers documented a dramatic decline. Between the early 1980s and 2011, intertidal oyster reefs in the region shrank by roughly 66%. The trend continued in the years that followed, contributing to an overall collapse of nearly 90% across Florida's Big Bend coastline. There was no single disaster to blame. Instead, several problems were working together. Extended droughts reduced fresh water flowing from the Suwannee River. Water withdrawals upstream further limited that flow. As a result, salinity levels increased throughout the coastal ecosystem, creating conditions that stressed oyster populations. As reefs died, another problem emerged. Young oyster larvae were still drifting through the water, but the reefs they depended on were collapsing. Without solid surfaces to attach to, many never survived. Each year, the reefs became flatter, weaker, and less capable of rebuilding themselves. The situation looked painfully familiar. About 100 miles away, Apalachicola Bay was experiencing a similar collapse. Once considered one of America's most productive oyster fisheries, it had suffered severe declines after record-low river flows. The crisis became so serious that Florida ultimately brought a case before the United States Supreme Court over upstream water usage. Even that effort failed to reverse the damage. By the time researchers examined what remained of places like Lone Cabbage Reef, optimism was in short supply. Millions of dollars had already been spent on restoration projects, with little success. But hidden within the water was a clue that most people had overlooked, and it would lead scientists toward a completely different solution than anyone expected. The unusual plan that nobody expected to work as RIM. Researchers searched for answers. They kept returning to one frustrating reality. Florida had already spent years trying to restore oyster reefs, yet many of those projects produced disappointing results. Millions of dollars had gone into traditional methods, but the reefs continued to decline. That forced scientists at the University of Florida to ask a question few others were willing to consider. What if the problem was never a shortage of oysters? To find out, researchers began studying the waters around Lone Cabbage Reef more closely. What they discovered challenged a long-standing assumption. Oyster larvae were still present throughout the ecosystem. In fact, countless young oysters were drifting through the currents every year. The issue was not that oysters were gone. The issue was that they had nowhere left to settle. Over time, many reefs had collapsed into flat sandbars. Without a solid surface to attach to, The larvae had little chance of surviving long enough to rebuild the population. That realization changed everything. Instead of focusing on producing more oyster larvae and hatcheries, the team decided to concentrate on rebuilding the physical structure that had once supported entire reef systems. If they could recreate the right habitat, nature might do much of the remaining work on its own. The plan was surprisingly simple. Researchers selected locally sourced dolomite limestone, the same type of rock found near healthy oyster reefs in the region. They carefully designed the new reef to match the height and structure of thriving natural reefs nearby. Rather than creating a perfectly uniform barrier, they used different-sized stones to form gaps, crevices, and surfaces that could support marine life. Funding for the ambitious project came from an unexpected source. Following the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010, settlement funds were directed toward environmental restoration projects across the Gulf Coast. Approximately $8.3 million helped make the Lone Cabbage Reef project possible. Construction began in 2018, but the effort involved far more than simply dropping rock into the water. Local fishermen and oyster harvesters became essential partners in the project. Before any limestone was placed, crews carefully relocated thousands of bushels of living oysters from the construction zone. The reef itself was then built across multiple restoration sites, following the footprint of a historic reef system that had existed for centuries. When the final loads of limestone and recycled shell were in place, the work crews left, and the waiting began. No one knew whether the experiment would succeed, but beneath the surface, a chain reaction was already starting, and what happened over the following months would exceed even the most optimistic expectations. The incredible test that changed everything. At first, there was little visible evidence that the project was working. To anyone passing by on a boat, the newly constructed reef looked like a simple line of rock resting beneath the water. But below the surface, an extraordinary transformation was already underway. Almost immediately, microscopic organisms began colonizing the limestone. Thin biological films formed across the rock, creating the conditions needed for marine life to settle and grow. Before long, young oyster larvae drifting through the currents started attaching themselves to the new habitat. The researchers had been right. The oysters had never disappeared. They had simply been waiting for a place to call home. As months turned into years, the results became impossible to ignore. Oyster populations on the restored reef dramatically outperformed nearby unrestored areas. In some sections, densities reached many times higher than those found at natural control sites. The reef was also attracting a growing variety of wildlife. Fish returned. Birds became more common. Even large predators such as bald eagles were being spotted in greater numbers around the area. The ecosystem was beginning to rebuild itself. But impressive monitoring data was not enough to prove long-term success. The true test would come from nature itself. Between 2023 and 2024, Florida's Big Bend region was struck by 3 hurricanes in just over a year. Hurricane Idalia brought record storm surge to Cedar Key. Hurricane Debbie followed not long afterward. Then came Hurricane Helene, delivering even greater destruction across the region. Homes were flooded. Businesses suffered major losses. Shellfish farmers watched years of work disappear almost overnight. If the restored reef was ever going to fail, this was the moment. Yet after the storms passed, researchers returned to inspect the site and found something remarkable. The reef had endured. The limestone structure remained intact. Oyster populations continued to thrive, and the restoration work showed little evidence of serious disruption. The project had survived exactly the kind of extreme conditions that increasingly threaten coastlines around the world. Today, Lone Cabbage Reef is widely regarded as one of Florida's most successful oyster restoration efforts. Scientists acknowledge that it has not solved every challenge facing the region. Freshwater shortages, climate pressures, and future storms remain significant concerns. But the project revealed something many people had started to doubt. Given the right conditions, nature can recover far faster than expected. What began as a bold experiment in a struggling bay became proof that a collapsing ecosystem could fight its way back. And perhaps the most incredible part is that the reef's greatest achievement was not what scientists built, but what nature built after they stepped aside and gave it the chance. Thanks for watching. What do you think about this incredible restoration project? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe and check out another video for more amazing stories.